The next subject area, where you almost have to be a lawyer to understand a lot of these things, is called your customer's rights. And it was interesting doing the research on this particular subject area, because there's just so many different things that exist out there, and I'm just trying to, boil it down into something that is somewhat mentally manageable, not only for myself, more so for myself than anyone else in the room, but it is very, very important, again, that you have a clear understanding. There are some customer rights that exist out there that we all need to be cognizant of when we are out selling our product in the marketplace. So what are they? So what are the rights that your customers have? Well, there's the Sales of Goods Act that came into place quite a few years ago, back in 1979. And under this particular act, goods must be as described. So if you come up with a definition of what the good is or the product is, you have to absolutely clearly describe it. It should be of satisfactory quality, and of course there's a little bit of wiggle room there as to what is satisfactory, what the quality is, what is satisfactory quality of the product. It must be fit for the purpose intended. In other words, you can't sell a particular product that under the premise or under one premise, but it's not really meeting that particular premise at all. So you really have to be consistent with respect to making sure that you describe it for the fit or for the purpose of which it is primarily intended. Again, under the Sale of Goods Act, fit for the purpose means that for both the everyday purpose as well as any specific purpose that is being agreed upon by the purchaser and the seller. So you can't deviate as you describe something to an end user operator. This is how product A, B, C is going to work. You can't deviate from that, I should say, with the actual product itself. Product must match any samples that were shown to the buyer. In other words, you can't show them your best model and then sell them your best model minus X or minus Y. It's got to be exactly as, or improved. Okay, you've got to sell them exactly what you've showed them to begin with, I should say. And the product sold must match any description that may have appeared in a brochure for any specific product. So once you start putting something in writing, you then got to make sure that that is what you actually deliver to your customer out there. You can't deviate from that whatsoever. Fit for the purpose intended. Well, I got the word hum up here because there's could be a little bit of a wiggle room. I guess it all depends upon how your lawyers interpret things. It means must be fit for everyday purpose and any specific purpose that you agreed upon with the actual seller itself. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you here is don't oversell your product. Don't say it can do this, 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 and this if it really doesn't, if it really can't. Alrighty. Don't say it can do 5,000 dishes an hour or whatever, and it really doesn't even come close to that. Or whatever the product might be, or whatever it is that you're trying to sell or selling to your customers, make sure that it is very, very specific, again, that you don't oversell it. Because once you start overselling it, that's when you start getting yourself into a lot of trouble. All items must match any sample that you have shown to a customer and any description that exists in a brochure and or company literature, which I've already mentioned just a few moments ago, because it bears repeating again because it's so important that you have consistency between what you're actually showing and what you're delivering and any literature that you might have out there. For fit for the purpose intended, if any or all of the above on the previous slides that I just showed up here is not in compliance, then the retailer, which in this particular case in our industry would be equipment and supply dealers, and not the manufacturer, is in breach of the contract, and the purchaser will have claim under the Sale of Goods Act. Okay. So that's very, very important to keep in mind. Once you have an intermediary in the channel that's actually selling product to the end user operator, it's incumbent, upon that intermediary, in this particular case, the equipment and supply dealers or distributors, that they are in compliance with everything prior to what I've said up here in the slides. But the Sales of Goods Act does not apply to goods that have been purchased on a hire purchase basis. Okay, which we're going to start talking about here right now as to what hire purchase is versus leasing, because it flows directly into this particular subject matter. All right, leasing, I'm just going to go back and give you a quick definition of each one of these because, again, hire purchase and leasing, they're two very, very different areas, though there are some similarities and each one has its own implications and as far as managing it and financing it, etc. Under leasing is a contract in which one party, the leaseor, permits to use the asset for a specified period to another party, which is the lessee, in exchange for periodic payments for a specified period of time. Okay? That's the very, very simple, very, very quick definition of what leasing is all about. Versus hire purchasing, it's much more complicated, and I don't know if you can see it very well or not, but I'll read it off to you. A quick definition of hire purchasing is an agreement in which the hire vendor transfers an asset to the hire purchaser for consideration. The consideration is the form of a hire purchase price. Okay, what's the specific price going to be? Which includes a cash down payment and various installments over the period of the hire purchase. The hire purchase price is normally higher than the cash price of the article because of the interest charges, which are often and part of or included in the actual price itself. This installment paid by the hirer at the periodic intervals up to a specified period of time. So it could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. And the installment is a sum of the finance charges, the interest, the capital payments, which would also include the principal of that particular product itself. So that is a definition of a hire purchase. Now, sticking with hire purchase just for a few moments longer, to be valid, a hire purchase agreement must be in writing and signed by both parties and must clearly lay out the following types of information. That type of information is a clear description of the actual goods themselves, the cash price for the actual goods. Alrighty. So if the purchaser was to actually buy this table, then it needs to be the actual purchase price. If you were to pay for it in cash, has to be mentioned. The hire purchase price, in other words, the total sum that must be paid to the hire and the actual purchase of the goods themselves. So if this table, I don't know, let's say it was 100 pounds, and under the hire purchase agreement, the total bill might be, I don't say 120 pounds over a 5-year period of time, but the actual price of the table itself of 100 pounds needs to be in the actual agreement, as well as the actual deposit itself. Some other things, the monthly installments in most states or most areas require that the applicable interest rate is also disclosed. So is it going to be 1%, 5%, 20%, whatever the percentage or interest rate is, and regulate the rates and charges that can be applied in any hire purchase transaction. And next, a reasonably comprehensive statement of the parties' rights. Sometimes they include the right to cancel the agreement during a cooling off period or at the end of the actual agreement itself. So those are the things that are part of a hire purchase agreement between the buyer and the seller. The last one I got up here is the right of the hirer to terminate the contract when he or she feels like doing so with a valid reason. That's all part of the contract of a hire purchase agreement already. That's all of the things that are required under a hire purchase agreement. So some of the specifics and differences between hire purchase and leasing. On the left-hand side, I've got about half a dozen slides here, and it talks about ownership. Not working there. It talks about ownership and different factors that I'll mention here. But under a hire purchase, the agreement is entered for the transfer of ownership after a prescribed period of time. So, hypothetical, an airline, this is a good example. An airline will enter into a hire purchase agreement with an aircraft manufacturer, with a leasing company, or a hire purchase company, and then after a prescribed period of time, whether it be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, then it will talk about, it'll mention the ownership will now shift from the leasing company or the hire purchase company to the actual airline itself. Alrighty. The airline will then take over the ownership of that actual piece of equipment, in this particular case, an aircraft. Versus under leasing is an operating lease, and where ownership is not transferred at all. Okay? So going back to the airline example, Boeing aircraft or Airbus, they could say under a leasing agreement, you're going to lease this, British Airways, you're going to lease this airplane for 20 years or 15 years, whatever the period of time is. And at the end of that time, we're going to take it back and we're going to sell it on the open market. Versus a hire purchase, it's just the opposite. At the end of the 15 or 20-year lease, British Airways would then take over that particular aircraft. They would actually own it. All right. So translate that into this industry. In what you are potentially selling a customer, give them an option of leasing or a hire purchase arrangement, and the transfer of ownership would vary versus one versus the other. Under the agreement type, under a hire purchase, it's a tri-party agreement between the, not between, I should say, under, am I looking at the right one? Yes, under, I got to operate these two things differently. My computer's not hooked up to these screens, so I'm trying to synchronize the two. Under the agreement type, under hire purchase, it's a tri-party agreement involving the seller, the finance company, as well as the purchaser. All right, so it's three individual organizations or entities involved. Again, repeating the seller, the finance company, and the actual purchaser. In some cases, the finance company and the seller could be the same organization or the same company, or a division of the manufacturer. Some of the, going back to the airline example, some of these companies like Boeing and Airbus, a lot of them have their own finance arm. It's a totally separate company, but they have the ability to finance purchases. Versus under a leasing is only a bi-party agreement involving the lessor and the lessee. So there's no third party involved whatsoever. Under depreciation claim, which is the next area of differentiation, under a hire purchase, depreciation is claimed by the purchaser or the hirer in the hire purchase agreement, versus under leasing is actually claimed by the lessor in any particular type of lease agreement. Already. Again, that's important from an operating perspective, or for any operator in the food service industry. Writing off the depreciation of pieces of equipment in some cases is their profit or loss differential. If they can't write it off, then it could significantly affect their bottom line, which in turn, could significantly increase their tax or decrease their tax liability. The next one, buyer count. This is interesting. Under a hire purchase, the goods or property are sold once and there cannot be more than one buyer. Versus under a leasing, the buyer count is an operating lease through the lessor, though the lessor can be one person or there can be a number of lessees. So for example, if I owned a building and I could give you a lease, and for, I don't know, say this building right here, this is, I don't know how many square meters here,
A lot.
10,000 square meters here, let's say. And if I lease this entire building from the owner, and I said, geez, I want to sublease it to Nick. I want to sublease part of it to Nick. I can do that. Or I could sublease part of it to Nick and sublease part of it to Keith or somebody else. That's what I mean, or is meant, I should say, with respect to the buyer count. So there can be multiple lessees under the leasing arrangement or agreement, but under a hire purchase, no. There's only one other individual in the transaction other than the actual seller of the space itself. Under period of agreement, under a hire purchase is normally longer as valuable goods or properties are purchased. Hence, if you're going to be selling or selling an aircraft, for example, that is going to be flying for 15 or 20 years, then you're more apt to go for a hire purchase agreement versus if you have a product like a fryer or an oven or any particular piece of equipment that we sell in the food service industry. The normal period of time is significantly less than a huge capital goods item like an aircraft that I just mentioned, using that as the example. So you're more apt as an end user operator to go to the leasing route because equipment changes in this industry so very, very quickly. More energy efficient pieces of equipment are always coming on the forefront, new technology, and so on and so forth. So as an end user operator, I would want to make the assumption that you don't want to get stuck in a long-term lease or a hire purchase agreement because, again, changing technology will force a lot of companies to look at the leasing agreement. And then relationships in the agreement under a hire purchase scenario, the relationship between the seller and the buyer is that of an owner and a hirer, versus under a leasing agreement is a lease agreement that the relationship is between the leaseor and the leasee. All right, very simple, pretty straightforward with respect to that. And transfer of ownership. This is interesting as well. Another difference between the two. Under a hire purchase, ownership passes on to the buyer only on the last installment from the finance company. That's when the ownership transfers to the actual owner of the piece of equipment, or the company in this particular case, or restaurateur or hotel has that particular piece of equipment. Versus leasing, ownership will pass on when the leaseor has acquired enough money from the leasee, which is equivalent to the actual value of the goods or equipment that has been sold to the individual. And the last one, next to last, under a hire, for sales tax, under a hire purchase, is paid by the buyer on the total value of the goods in a hire purchase, versus under leasing, it depends upon the actual value of the time at the time of sale in the actual leasing agreement. So there's a slight difference that exists between those two particular ones. And under payment defaults, if you are a nasty operator and you don't have the funds to make the payments on a timely basis, on a hire purchase, any default in payment of an installment enables the seller or the finance company to seize the goods from the purchaser or the hirer almost immediately. It needs to be written into the actual contract itself. So you can provide in the contract some degree of leeway as to what constitutes a default payment. Is it literally on the first of the month or last day of the month, or there's some wiggle room, 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that. That can all be written into the actual contract itself. And on a payment default from the leasing side of perspective, on the termination, the difference is on the termination of the lease agreement. If an operating lease, in an operating lease, you say the equipment can be taken back by the leaseor immediately already. So those are the differences with respect to payment defaults. Interest rates, which is the next one, if I can get, there we go. Under interest rates, under hire purchase, is charged on a flat rate, which is distributed for the entire period of the agreement and collected along with the principal on the equivalent or equal monthly basis. Alrighty, so the interest rate is stated right up front. It's built into the actual agreement, purchasing agreement, and charged. So you don't know exactly every single month, how much you're paying on interest versus principal. Under leasing, does not form a major part of the actual lease agreement at all, but the lease charges will include interest as part of the actual monthly agreement. So again, some subtle differences that exist between the two. Any questions on that? Again, you need to almost consult a lawyer. Not almost, I would strongly suggest you consult a lawyer, and I'm farthest thing from a lawyer at this particular point. But once you get into the real subtle differences that exist between the two, then you really need to dig into the details. And what I'm showing you here is just a cursory look at some of the issues and some of the areas that you really need to be cognizant of when you are when you're dealing with these two particular things. Is that a cut to stop?
It's probably a good time to stop on coffee break, given the next chapter that you got, Doug.